All right, Salam. Welcome back to another reading of our book, The Black Jews of Africa. This will be chapter 10 on actually our last chapter in our reading. And it's going to be on African Jews in Eastern and Southern Africa. All right, and today we will be reading on, one portion of this chapter will be on the Abayudaya of Uganda. So let's begin. For more than 80 years, a religious group in Uganda has considered itself Jewish and practiced Judaism. Following numerous contacts with Jewish organizations in February 2002, around 400 members of the Abayudaya community, which includes around 800 people, were formally converted to Judaism by U.S. and Israeli conservative rabbis. The case of the Abayudaya is not unique. This phenomenon of spontaneous adherence to Judaism without any direct contact with the Jewish community reminds us of the case of the Italian village of San Nicandro, Italy, San Nicandro, or whatever, Italy, where a small group of people adhered to Judaism between the two world wars. In the Puglia region, a group of individuals followed a certain Donato Mondizio, 1885-1948, who introduced them to the Old Testament. Later on, they came into contact with Jews, and most of them migrated to Israel after the war. At the origin of the Abayudaya community was a charismatic person, Same Lua Kelenzi Kakungulu, a brilliant military chief who converted to Protestantism during the 1880s. Kakungulu cooperated with the British and aspired to establish his own kingdom and to be recognized as Kabaka, king of the eastern region of Uganda. His hopes, however, were dashed. In 1913, he abandoned his military and political activities and began to concentrate on matters of faith and religion. In the unstable conditions after the imposition of protectorate, new groupings of a political religious kind crystallized. Kakungulu started out being close to a local Protestant church, the Bamalaki, whose faith rested on devotion to the Bible and who regarded Sunday as the Sabbath. The Bamalaki appeared in Uganda in 1930 and contested the British authorities on religious grounds. The followers of this sect were Protestants whose faith rested on a fundamentalist devotion to the Bible, relying on the Old Testament. An important principle of this new faith was violent opposition to the use of medicines and immunizations for human beings and animals, referring among many other verses to Jeremiah. In vain shalt thou use many medicines, for thou shalt not be cured. Jeremiah chapter 46, verse 11. Kakungulu began to study and meditate on the Old Testament for long periods of time and was stricter than the Bamalaki in the observance of all Moses' commandments. He then opposed the Bamalaki on the issue of circumcision. As the Bamalaki claimed that circumcision of 8-day-old male children was practiced only by Jews, Kakungulu declared himself Abayudaya, which means Jew in Uganda. Nevertheless, although he declared himself a Jew, he still believed at that time in the New Testament and in Jesus Christ, Jesus Cristo. In 1919, Kakungulu started a separated sect known as the Community of Jews Who Trust in the Lord. Kebina kia Abayudaya abisiga katonda. and then demanded that his followers adhere to all the laws of the Bible without exception. Kakungulu was circumcised, as were his sons, and he urged the members of his family and his followers to do the same. Some Christian leaders tried to influence Kakungulu to return to Christianity. Kakungulu used many verses of the Old Testament to show that one must join the Jews. His religious convictions, including his objection to medicine, brought him into ever-increasing conflict with the British administration, and he was obliged to retire from his last official post as chief of Buketi. The missionary John Roscoe, who visited Kakungulu and his followers in the 1920s in Mbali, describes Kakungulu's switch to Judaism, saying, "The zeal of his party is considerable, and they show a great desire to learn, read, and write. Kakungulu is a chief of considerable means and much influence, so that he is able to build schools and employ teachers in his own district, where the teaching is regular and daily services are held. The teachers wear turbans like the Jews of old times. In fact, the headdress is copied from pictures. They observe Saturday as a day of rest and keep it much more strictly than the Christians do their Sunday. They have formulated for themselves a religion out of this strange medley of ideas, and their conduct is in complete accordance with their beliefs." From sections in the Bible that seemed to him important, Kakungulu compiled a guidebook of rules and prayers in Uganda for the members of his community, which was printed in 1922. In it, Kakungulu demanded complete faith in the Old Testament and all its commandments. In 1923, he built up a small place of worship near his house in Gangana, which he named Jewish Church. When in 1926 he met a Jewish trader called Joseph, another phase began in the Abayudayah's appropriation of Judaism. Joseph agreed to Kakungulu's request to educate him in the Jewish faith. Great changes took place in the religious life of the Abayudayah. They stopped believing in the New Testament and in Jesus Christ. Joseph taught the Abayudayah both Jewish blessings and customary prayers, and they began to observe the Sabbath strictly. They practiced ritual head covering. And ate the meat only of animals they had slaughtered. All Jewish festivals and feasts were celebrated. Kakungulu even divorced his wife because she refused to abandon Christianity and became Jewish. Before he left, Joseph gave Kakungulu a voluminous Bible written in Hebrew and English. Kakungulu began to compile a new book of prayers, devoid of quotations from the New Testament, but he died before he could have published it. A few months later, Kakungulu's death, another European Jew whom Kakungulu had encountered in Kampala visited the region and told the community that they should follow Moses completely. In what context did the Abayudayah's faith arise? After all, a community faithfully practicing self-instructed mainstream Judaism at the far end of Africa, having discovered the religion on their own, seems a peculiar phenomenon. But what brought about this miracle? Kakungulu's establishment, whose religious views were constantly evolving. Before 1914, he supported many evangelists from the Christian Missionary Society in Buketi. After 1914, he was the Bamalaki's religion most generous supporter. in eastern Uganda. But why was Kakungulu's final faith Jewish? In addition to the vivid assimilation of the Old Testament of Kakungulu and his followers, a number of influences, both direct and indirect, incited the Abayudayah's self-delineation as Jews. Time and time again, we have seen how Christian and colonial discourse, drawing on evangelical hopes and expectations, were rooted in British imperial needs and attitudes, and disseminated the concept of the lost tribes of Israel. Sir Harry Johnston, the first British administrator of the Uganda protectorate, and a great defender of the Hamitic myth, said that Phoenicians or Canaanites carried Jewish ideas of religion as far as the eastern part of the Black continent. One characteristic of early CMS preaching in Uganda, as well as evangelical and Anglican preaching in Britain in the late 19th century, was the appropriation of ancient Judaism. Henry Nevinson, one of these missionaries, recalled, "The strictly biblical education produced among those like myself belongs to the last century. The peculiar illusion that both the promises and the threatening of the Jewish lawgivers and prophets were especially designed for ourselves by a foreseeing power. We never doubted that the English evangelicals were the chosen people." Okay, just give me 1 second. Okay. O'Flaherty, a CMS missionary, added to this discourse and stressed at the Uganda court that Jesus Christ was a Jew, and we Europeans did not follow one of our race. We looked for the truth where it was to be found, and we found it among the Jews. Robert Walker, another CMS missionary, noted during the 1890s that the customs and manners of the Jews were of greatest interest in Uganda. After meeting Kakungulu and his followers in Mbale in 1904, J.J. Willis proclaimed, "In the economy of missions in this part of Uganda are called upon to play a part not dissimilar to that played by the Jews in the first stage of Christianity. Wherever the apostles went in their missionary travels, they found Jews of their own race and language, possessing and acknowledging the same scriptures and animated by the same faith and hope." It is clear that these views added to the profound influence of the Hebrew Bible itself in the lives of uncertain Ugandan people, nurtured the adhesion of the Abayudaya to Judaism. With respect to political and socio-cultural factors, Kakungulu's shift to Judaism was largely the result of his disenchantment with British rule. A dispute over land in the Makerere region became a focus for the development of anti-British sentiment in Uganda. Kakungulu's final dismissal as Mbale County Chief in 1923 was understood as one more example of arbitrary British protectorate behavior. After Kakungulu's death in 1928, the community, which had grown to 2,000 people at its peak, declined as a result of internal rivalries for the leadership of the group. not to mention the problems specific to any isolated minority. By the 1960s, the group was reduced to 300 people and languished for lack of contact with the Jewish world. The vigorous activities of the Christian missionaries and their great influence in Uganda also had an impact. In the 1960s and 1970s, many of the community children became Christian while attending mission schools, and the community then consisted mainly of elderly people, women, and small children. In this context, in the 1960s, an Israeli diplomat, Abayudayah, who held a post in Uganda and who published several articles in Israel, England, and the United States, was instrumental in establishing connections with world Jewry. By his permanent contacts with the Abayudaya after he had left Uganda, Oded began the process of adopting internationally recognized standards of Jewish practice. He succeeded in interesting several Israeli personalities in the Abayudaya, among them the president of Israel, Yitzhak Ben Zvi, and the chairman of the World Union for the Propagation of Judaism, Dr. Israel Ben Ze'ev. Dr. Israel Ben Ze'ev. Ben Ze'ev showed much enthusiasm regarding the connections with the Abayudaya as an important turning point in the WPJ's activities and the start of the conversion of Africans to Judaism. The community received mezuzat, prayer shawls, and other religious articles from Oded and from the WUP. The Abayudaya began to observe all of the festivals mentioned in the Bible. They built Sukkot, tabernacles on the festival of the same name. They did not eat hametz, leavened bread, during Passover, and during Pentecost, the harvest festival. They brought in the first fruits of the season and sold them to meet the needs of the synagogue. As a result, contacts with Israel and the world Jewry contributed spiritually and morally to the community. And in 1962, the community was officially recognized by the government of Uganda. The community again grew to about 800, partly due to the return of some who had previously left it. But during Idi Amin's dictatorship, the Abayudaya were outlawed and had to stop their activities, concealing their Jewishness lest they be arrested or murdered. Some converted to Islam or Christianity. It was only in 1969, after Idi Amin's fall, that contacts and correspondence with the outside world were renewed. In the early 1980s, Gershom Sizomu, a grandson of Kakungulu's successor, reclaimed the land to build a synagogue, which restored the community's focus. In 1995, the visit of the American-based Jewish organization Colonial, which helped the community religiously and financially, particularly the children's schooling, marked a new step in the process that led to the formal integration of the Abayudaya in the Jewish world. The community now has university students and graduates and a Jewish high school, and the main synagogue has been enlarged and improved. Later on, with the financial help of the Institute for Jewish and Community Research in San Francisco, the spiritual leader of the community, Rabbi Sizomu, attended the Ziegler School of Rabbinic Studies at the University of Judaism, with the goal of opening a yeshiva in Uganda. As the Abayudaya has developed significant relationships with Jews around the world, life is changing for the community. So in February 2002, rabbis from the United States and Israel formally converted the Abayudaya. This was agreed upon by 2/3 of the community more than 80 years after Kakungulu embraced Judaism. After the first conversion, Rabbi Gori noted, "Today's ceremony is not a conversion, but a strengthening of what you have always believed." In an article in Totally Jewish 2002 that points out the growing interaction between the Abayudaya and outside Jewish visitors, Oded stressed that the Israeli Ministry of the Interior seemed determined to consider the Abayudaya as Jews with regard to the benefits of Aliyah, which means the settlement in Israel. The Abayudaya's affiliation with Judaism seems to appeal to Jewish universalism, opening up the definitions of the category of the dispersed, what Parfit names a kind of transnational community. One can say that the Abayudaya have experienced, albeit in a limited way, the messianic process of gathering the dispersed that began in the fertile ground of the creation of the state of Israel, which permitted a further relaxing of ethnic barriers. Their vivid thirst for Judaism, combined with the universalistic vision of the association supporting the Nidhei Israel, gave their aspirations reality. Okay. The Lemba of South Africa and Zimbabwe. Okay, the Lemba of southern, central, and eastern Zimbabwe and northeastern South Africa barely differ from the neighboring Venda or Shona groups with whom they share the same language. In July 1986, an article in the Pretoria News proclaimed, "Tribe claims Jewish link," and went on to say, as Israel struggles to absorb about 15,000 black Ethiopians into a modern Western society, tens of thousands of blacks in South Africa, Zimbabwe, and Mozambique are claiming descent from lost biblical tribes. Spokesmen for the Lemba people say they originated around 8600 from a Jewish tribe in what is today Yemen. Professor Mativa, president of the Lemba Cultural Organization, said his people traced their source to Sena. They believe their forefathers were among people who crossed the Strait of Hormuz, some heading for Ethiopia while the others moving south. They trekked around the Horn of Africa and down the Indian Ocean coast to form an arc of settlements between Mozambique and the northern Transvaal. Professor Mathiva commented, "Our entire outlook on life is Jewish. The few males who reject circumcision by the age of 15 will not be able to marry a Lemba girl." He then added that his people were following with interest the progress of the Falasha in Israel. Since this period, the Lemba have used their oral history and traditional customs associated with the Semitic identity propagated by the colonial officials to claim a modern Jewish identity, often referring to themselves as the white men who came from Sena. The Lemba are also known as the Varemba, people who refuse, Vanwenye, foreigner, guest, Arab, Valungu, that is Europeans, non-Negroes or strangers, or Mushavi, that is traders. The meaning or origin of these different names gives rise to various explanations, each of which can be each of which can be linked to their oral tradition and suggests external influences in the past. It seems that ethnographers and missionaries from the early 20th century propagated the Semitic identity of the Lemba, placing emphasis on their differences from groups among whom they lived. Read that again. For instance, the famous ethnologist Henry Junod noted customs that suggested a Jewish link, such as circumcision, endogamy, observing a holy day each week, eating away from others, and obeying strict laws of purity. He noted that pork was excluded from the Lemba's diet, and that the meat they ate was subject to slaughtering rituals. While commenting on the strong Semitic characteristics of the Lemba and the fact that they lived scattered among the Busuto and Bothanga of those parts, exactly as the Jews amongst European nations, Juno deduced that this behavior was intended to protect a pure tribal identity. Hugh State also noted that the Lemba had marked Semitic characteristics, absorbed the language of the people whom they settled, and maintained by endogamy the purity of their race. He goes on to argue that the life and customs of these peculiar people are strangely reminiscent of the wandering Jews of medieval times, by which he evokes the Lemba habit of living by trading rather than farming. State also observed that the Lemba were feared for their superior intelligence. This may have been connected to their metalworking skill, but also to their knowledge of medicine and their position as surgeons in the circumcision schools. Both Janard and State suggested that the Lemba were endogamous in much the same way that Jewish communities should have been. And Junod records that the Lemba do not give their daughters to the Venda, but have no objection to taking foreign women as wives, integrating them into the tribe as Lemba. Observers and travelers who identify Lemba as Jews found phenotypical aspects attesting to their racial origin. In the 1930s, some of the early ethnographic works of State or Romello on the Lemba included profile photographs of the Lemba that established that they are Semitic looking and that they have Jewish noses. Jacques considered that many Lemba have straight noses, rather fine features, and an intelligent expression which distinguish them from the ordinary run of natives. One does occasionally meet with a Lemba who possesses strikingly Semitic features. One of my informants, Old Moshe, even had what might be termed a typical Jewish nose, a rare occurrence in any real Bantu. In fact, among all the arguments put forward by earlier observers of the Lemba, the idea emerged that they constituted a separate group distinct from the other surrounding Bantu groups and cared for preserving their tribal and ritual purity. The Semitic Hebrew Jewish account of the Lemba had been introduced in addition to the speculations of their non-Bantu origins. Following on this, Van Wormelo in the 1930s described their dietary rules, particularly those regarding the slaughter of animals and endogamy, as being of Semitic origin. and was convinced that they had progressively migrated southward. While the Lemba certainly pursued a different lifestyle from that of the people among whom they lived, these differences were perhaps exaggerated by ethnographers, including Frobenius, Jacques, Bullock, Thompson, and von Sicard, who propagated similar ideas, as did missionaries of the Swiss and Berlin white supremacy missions. In fact, from a theological point of view, the Lemba's customs and rituals reveal religious pluralism and interdependence of these various practices. If most of them belong to Christian churches, for example, the Zion Christian Church and Pentecostal groups, Muslim Lemba can also be found in Zimbabwe. The members of these groups tend to consider that they belong to Christianity or Islam in cultural rather than religious terms. These apparently religious identities do not prevent them from declaring themselves Jews through religious practice and ethnic identification. As Parfit reported, those Lemba who perceive themselves as ethnically Jewish find no contradiction in regularly attending a Christian church. By and large, the Lemba who are most stridently Jewish are often those with the closest Christian attachments. In what context did the Lemba's claim to Judaism arise? When the Lemba Cultural Association was created around 1947, multiple ethnic interests in the northern Transvaal evolved, competing for access to increasingly scarce resources. The founding of the association seems to express an ethnic consciousness in the context of government determination to divide communities along ethnic lines. The aims of the LCA's founder, Mr. Bulengwa, may well have been to prevent assimilation. To preserve the Lemba culture, Mr. Bulengwa incited them to maintain their eating habits, no pork, and endogamous practices, which recalled their Jewish connection. Gina Bugis comments, the founding of the association was an attempt through creating or recreating a separate and distinct cultural identity for the Lemba people to proclaim the value and importance of the Lemba in the northern Transvaal, and at the same time to identify them with a non-African community at a time when European domination seemed irreversible. This process of self-identification with Judaism has not been linear. On the contrary, among the Lemba who participated in Leroux's study, some observed that during the Black liberation struggle in South Africa, they preserved their culture, but were not so willing to be associated with a non-African white race. After the democratic elections of 1994, they again wanted to remain exclusive and preserve for posterity their separate and distinct cultural identity. This leads one to think that it represents a wider and more profound sentiment than a mere reaction to colonization. And with that, we will end here today, and we will pick up later on discovering the Lembas passed through their genes. And give thanks again for tuning in. It's very important that I and I delve through this history here, especially, like I said, for the ones that don't know this. This is a basic introduction into the origins of Judaism, and making a link with those Hebrews on the continent of Africa that have been making a claim for many years of their ancestry. And now people are finally beginning to wake up to this realization and these claims, testimonies of these Hebrew groups spread across the continent of Africa. But through all this, one must ask themselves, why did they return to that continent that we know today of as Africa? Makes you think. So, we also, another thing I wanted to stress is the importance of not using the continent of Africa to separate black people. Because even the name Africa can be very deceptive, because what it does is it tends to separate black people and put them in some cultural vacuum and put them in some, like if they're separated from the rest of the world, like anything across Africa had to have been Arab or Indo-Aryan or something like that. So, while this might seem simple-minded to some, nevertheless, this is very important, and the Almighty will have it no other way. The Almighty wants this truth to come forward, and the Almighty has a purpose for I and I through Jesus Christos amongst all people to accept this truth. So, like I was saying, I and I must not get confused when saying Africa. It just happens to be that continent that where they are today, known of as Africa, where they originally came from and spread across to the Shemite lands over in the so-called Middle East and northern Middle East that we see today. But he was originally the Asiatic black man who not only lived in Africa, however, lived all across the globe. So when I read this Black Jews of Africa to ones and ones, this is to broaden one's view of the truth on the very origin of Judaism, or the origins of the Hebrew people. And this is just scratching the surface on certain knowledge of the ancient peoples, the ancient Hebrews, the ancient Jews. And let there not be any mistake. They're not Africans. These are still Hebrews that are on the continent that we know today of as Africa. So with that, I just want to say salam, give thanks for tuning in, and stay tuned for our next reading on this chapter on the African Jews in Eastern and Southern Africa, on discovering the Lemba's past through their genes. And they didn't really have to do DNA tests. However, if that will give them some vindication, then so be it, So with that said, salam.